January 11, 1944. The skies over central Germany were a wall of chaos. Thunder rolled across the horizon, swallowing the sound of engines. Sheets of freezing rain struck the fields below, while black clouds twisted like smoke over the towns of Oschersleben and Halberstadt. Even the Luftwaffe radar operators could barely see their own screens. Inside their control towers, German pilots waited, confident the storm had grounded every Allied aircraft. No one, not even the most daring squadron commander, would fly through that. It was the kind of weather that swallowed entire formations. But then, the first echoes appeared. Radar blips, dozens of them, moving steadily east. Moments later, the impossible broke through the storm front. Dozens of silver bombers, their wings crusted with ice, roared straight into German airspace. Engines howled against the wind, contrails shredded by turbulence, formation lights flickering like ghosts. The storm that should have stopped the Americans had only hidden their approach. Down below, stunned Luftwaffe pilots ran for their aircraft. Realizing too late, the U.S. bombers weren't avoiding the storm. They were using it, and that day, the myth of German weather superiority began to die. By the end of 1943, the air war over Europe had entered a brutal new phase. The United States Army Air Forces had committed to a relentless daylight bombing campaign, an effort that aimed to destroy Nazi Germany's war machine from the sky. Their targets were deep inside the Reich: aircraft factories, oil refineries, and ball-bearing plants that kept the Wehrmacht moving. It was a campaign built on courage and calculation, but it came at a terrible cost. Flying in daylight made accuracy possible, yet it also made the bombers visible. The German Luftwaffe, still fierce and organized, struck from high altitudes and hidden clouds, turning every mission into a struggle for survival. For the Americans, the statistics told a story of determination bordering on madness. In just one mission over Schweinfurt in October 1943, out of 291 B-17 bombers, 60 never returned. Hundreds of airmen vanished into smoke and cloud, their parachutes flickering against the gray sky. It was a staggering loss, one that forced Allied commanders to rethink what acceptable risk truly meant. And yet, orders from the 8th Air Force headquarters in England remained clear: keep flying. Even nature itself had become part of the war. Europe's winter skies turned savage. Turbulent fronts sweeping in from the Atlantic, freezing temperatures icing over controls, and thick cloud cover that blinded even the most skilled navigators. These conditions grounded Luftwaffe fighters just as often as Allied bombers, but Germany believed the balance of weather favored them. Their radar network, short-range interceptors, and home field advantage meant they could strike when skies cleared and vanish when storms rolled in. American planners understood that. They also knew they couldn't wait for perfect conditions. Every delay gave the Reich another day to rebuild, another week to fortify, another month to strengthen its defenses. So the U.S. changed its philosophy. Weather would no longer dictate when they fought. It would become part of how they fought. By late 1943, meteorological teams were embedded with bomber groups. They studied jet streams, tracked Atlantic pressure systems, and learned to predict the chaos. Pilots were briefed to fly through, not around. The goal was to use the same storms that once grounded them as shields against radar and interception. It was a gamble, one born of desperation and courage. To the men of the 8th Air Force, it meant waking before dawn to scrape frost off propellers and climb into cockpits colder than iceboxes. They flew by instruments alone, sometimes for hours, seeing nothing but the glow of their dials and the pale flicker of lightning through the clouds. But these flights had a purpose far larger than survival. Each raid pushed deeper into German airspace, each target closer to the industrial heart of Hitler's war machine. And somewhere in that gray sky between England and Berlin, The balance of the air war began to shift, because even as the storms grew worse, the Americans kept coming, from the ground. German civilians watched the bombers pass overhead, slow, steady, undeterred, and wondered what kind of nation could send men willingly into weather that even birds avoided. Inside Luftwaffe command centers, officers debated whether the Americans were reckless or simply unstoppable. Some believed their crews were flying blind. Others suspected new technology. But the truth was simpler and far more unnerving. The United States had decided that no storm, no matter how violent, would stop them. And with that shift in mindset, the stage was set for one of the most astonishing moments of the air war, when American bombers would defy both the weather and the Luftwaffe itself. By early 1944, the air war over Europe had reached a critical point. The Americans were running out of time and patience. The Luftwaffe still dominated much of the continental airspace, and German industry continued to produce fighter aircraft faster than the Allies could destroy them. If the bombing campaign didn't cripple Germany soon, the planned Allied invasion of Western Europe, Operation Overlord, could face disaster before it even began. Commanders in England understood this pressure clearly. General Ira C. Eaker, who had led the 8th Air Force through its bloodiest months, had built the foundation for the daylight offensive. His successor, General Karl Spaatz, was determined to finish it. Both men believed the same thing. The only way to break Germany's power was to break its air force first. That meant forcing the Luftwaffe into the sky, no matter the weather. This was the origin of the missions that shocked the Germans, the relentless waves of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24, liberators that crossed the North Sea and disappeared into snow and cloud. In late January 1944, the Americans launched a series of deep penetration raids against aircraft factories at Oschersleben, Halberstadt, and Brunswick, targets shielded by some of the worst winter storms in years. Even experienced Luftwaffe meteorologists had declared the skies unflyable. To the Germans, the storm was an ally, one that would keep their cities safe and their pilots grounded. But the Americans saw it differently. At airfields across southern England, mechanics worked through the night, wiping ice from bomber wings and sealing fuel lines against the cold. Inside briefing huts, crews were told the words they dreaded and respected. "We're flying today." The plan was bold and almost suicidal. Flying through the storm would blind both Allied and German radar. It would also make formation flying nearly impossible. Yet, if they succeeded, the bombers could appear over their targets before the Luftwaffe had time to react. At dawn, the runways vanished beneath fog. Engines roared to life, and one by one, the massive bombers lifted into a sky that looked more like an ocean than air. Frost formed inside their oxygen masks. Lightning flashed around the wings. Somewhere above the clouds, the crews hoped to find a break. But all they found was more cloud, more wind, more chaos. Meanwhile, in Germany, radar operators at stations along the coast watched in confusion. Their screens flickered with interference. To them, it looked like the weather itself was attacking. But then, between the static, came faint signals, moving fast, in tight formation. The Luftwaffe scrambled what few fighters could take off. Most airfields were soaked in rain or buried in snow, leaving dozens of pilots stranded on the ground. Those who reached altitude couldn't believe what they saw. Entire formations of American bombers flying straight through the heart of the storm. Some German pilots called it madness. Others called it bravery. But the effect was the same: shock. Reports began reaching Berlin. Weather defenses had failed. Bombing groups were appearing where no aircraft should be able to fly. Commanders debated whether the Americans had developed new navigation technology, perhaps something tied to radar or magnetic guidance. In truth, it wasn't technology. It was willpower, and a changing philosophy of air warfare. Each mission through storm and lightning sent a message. America would not wait for clear skies to fight. The weather, once Germany's trusted ally, had turned against them. By February, even Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most respected aces, admitted that the Americans' persistence was breaking their advantage. "They fly in conditions," he said, "that ground even our best men." And as the winter of 1944 dragged on, those impossible missions paved the way for something far larger. A coordinated air offensive so massive it would change the course of the war. It was called Operation Argument, though history would remember it by another name: Big Week. The human angle inside, the cold, narrow fuselages of the B-17s and B-24s, the war was personal and physical. The men who flew these missions were often barely out of their 20s. Farm boys from Kansas, factory workers from Detroit, students who had never seen snow like this before England. Yet here they were, staring down storms that looked like living walls. Temperatures inside the bombers often dropped to 40 degrees. Frost covered the guns. Oxygen masks froze to faces. Gunners' hands stuck to the metal of their turrets. Even breathing was a struggle. Every man on board knew that one mechanical failure could mean death, not from bullets, but from the cold or a spin into the clouds below. And yet, the orders kept coming. No aborts due to weather. Pilots fought not just the enemy, but the aircraft itself. Their visibility was sometimes no more than a few feet. Entire formations disappeared into cloud, leaving crews flying blind, trusting only instruments and instinct. When lightning cracked across the sky, it illuminated hundreds of bombers at once. Fleeting silhouettes of courage carved into the storm. Some missions lasted 9 hours or more. When the crews finally returned, frostbite and exhaustion marked their faces. Still, when asked if they would fly again, most said yes. They didn't see it as bravery, just duty. They knew that every factory destroyed meant fewer German fighters in the sky, fewer bombs falling on London, and one step closer to ending the war. The technological angle. The Americans' ability to fly through these deadly weather fronts didn't come from recklessness alone. It came from innovation. One of their most valuable tools was the Norden bomb sight, a precision device that allowed bombardiers to aim through layers of cloud and turbulence with remarkable accuracy. Combined with new radar-assisted navigation systems like H2X Mickey, the U.S. could locate and strike targets even when visibility dropped to zero. The bombers themselves were also evolving. Engineers had developed de-icing systems that pumped glycol through the wings and tail, preventing ice buildup that once sent aircraft spiraling to their deaths. Heated flight suits kept crews alive at altitudes that would have frozen them solid only a year earlier. But technology alone wasn't enough. The Americans learned the art of formation flying, turning hundreds of planes into a single moving fortress. Each bomber's firepower protected the others, and even when the sky vanished into gray, they held the pattern. A single gap in formation could mean death, as German fighters waited for stragglers to emerge. Their ground teams, too, became masters of weather warfare. U.S. meteorological units used Atlantic data from ships and aircraft to map storm systems days in advance. They learned to identify the windows, narrow corridors of calmer air within violent fronts, and timed raids to exploit them. This combination of courage, science, and strategy began to shift the air war's balance. Where once the Luftwaffe relied on weather as an ally, it now became their enemy. German interceptors like the Bf-109 and Fu-190 struggled to climb through heavy cloud and crosswinds. Their shorter range and lack of advanced instruments made them vulnerable to disorientation. While American bombers forced their way through the weather, many German pilots found themselves grounded, watching helplessly as the sky filled with the drone of distant engines. Even the Luftwaffe's radar network, once a source of pride, faltered in storms. Lightning and interference scrambled signals, masking the movement of Allied formations. To the German command, it seemed as if the Americans had vanished, only to reappear over vital cities like Leipzig, Brunswick, and even Berlin. By turning nature's fury into a weapon of their own, the U.S. Air Forces had done something extraordinary. They'd taken away Germany's final advantage in the skies. And this shift didn't just reshape tactics, it changed the psychology of the war. Because for every German pilot staring at a radar screen, there was a single haunting question forming in his mind. If the Americans can fly through this, what can possibly stop them? The German perspective, from inside the control rooms of Luftwaffe airfields, disbelief slowly turned into anxiety. Reports came in from radar operators near the North Sea coast. Unidentified formations approaching through storm cover. At first, officers dismissed them as malfunctions. Storm interference was common. But within hours, confirmation poured in from multiple stations, bombers, dozens of them, flying directly through the heart of a winter system. For years, the Luftwaffe had relied on the weather as its shield. Clouds were their camouflage, storms their fortress. German interceptors had shorter range and weaker navigational instruments than their American counterparts. In severe weather, they stayed grounded or operated only locally. Their entire strategy rested on the assumption that no one, not even the Americans, would dare to fly under those conditions. That illusion shattered in early 1944. At first, the German pilots laughed it off. "The Americans are crazy," one squadron leader reportedly said. "They'll kill themselves before they reach Berlin." But as the bombers began striking targets with growing precision, the laughter stopped. Luftwaffe ace Günther Röhl later recalled his shock at seeing American formations emerge from storm clouds over Brunswick. "We thought they were ghosts," he said. "They came out of nowhere, bombed, and vanished back into the weather." The psychological effect was devastating. The Germans were fighting an enemy they could no longer predict. Even nature, once a trusted ally, seemed to have switched sides. And with every mission that defied weather, the myth of German control over European skies crumbled further. The tactical angle behind the bravery was a cold, calculated strategy. American commanders had realized that weather could be weaponized, not just endured. The concept was simple but revolutionary. Attack when the enemy expects you least. When German intelligence predicted the weather would ground Allied bombers, those were the days to strike. The Luftwaffe's rigid command structure and dependence on ground-based radar made it slow to adapt. If the Americans attacked in storms, it would disrupt everything: radar coordination, fighter takeoff timing, even anti-aircraft accuracy. This thinking shaped Operation Argument. The massive series of coordinated attacks in February 1944, later called Big Week. The U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces launched thousands of bombers against aircraft factories and industrial centers across Germany. The raids were timed during unstable weather fronts that stretched from France to Poland. It was a logistical nightmare. Winds of over 100 miles per hour tore through bomber formations, ice-coated wings. Entire squadrons lost visibility. Yet, despite these dangers, the bombers pressed on. Supported by new long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, which could now accompany them deep into German airspace. On the ground, German defenses faltered. Anti-aircraft gunners couldn't track through the cloud cover, and many interceptors scrambled too late or too low. The storm that was supposed to protect the Reich now blinded it. The moral angle. There was also a moral undercurrent to this strategy, one that weighed heavily on both sides. For the American crews, flying through storms felt like tempting fate. Many believed they were being asked to die not for victory, but for message, a statement of unstoppable resolve. Yet within that suffering lay a kind of unity. Crews formed bonds that outlasted the war itself, united by the memory of skies filled with thunder and courage. On the German side, the same weather that once symbolized safety now carried dread. Civilians listened for the distant hum of engines and prayed the storms would hold. But time and again, the clouds broke, revealing silver bombers cutting through lightning. By the end of February 1944, even hardened Luftwaffe veterans admitted the truth. Weather no longer belonged to Germany. The skies, chaotic, brutal, and unforgiving, were now ruled by those willing to fly through them. And as both sides stared into that turbulent horizon, they sensed a shift neither could reverse. The storm had changed, and from within it, the Americans were coming. February 20th, 1944, England, 0400 hours. The wind screamed across the airfields of East Anglia. Floodlights flickered over lines of B-17s and B-24s coated in frost. Mechanics worked silently, their breath rising in clouds of steam. The storm over the North Sea hadn't lifted. In fact, it was growing worse. Most expected a delay, but at 0430, a single order rolled through the base loudspeakers. Calm, absolute, and final. Mission confirmed. We fly today. This was the beginning of Operation Argument, known later as Big Week. It would become one of the most decisive air offensives of the Second World War. The goal? Cripple Germany's aircraft industry once and for all. More than 1,000 American bombers and 800 escort fighters prepared for takeoff. Their targets stretched across Germany: Leipzig, Gotha, Regensburg, Brunswick, and Stuttgart. Factories producing Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were to be struck simultaneously, overwhelming the Luftwaffe's ability to defend. The problem was the weather. Across northern Europe, a fierce low-pressure system was forming, bringing sleet, violent winds, and near-zero visibility. Every meteorologist warned against flying. Even British commanders urged postponement. But General Karl Spaatz refused. He believed this storm was a weapon, one that could conceal the bomber streams from radar and delay German fighters from organizing. If we wait for clear skies, he said, we'll be waiting until summer. At dawn, the first formations roared off the runways. Engines shook the fog, thunder merging with thunder. Crews could see nothing, not even the plane beside them. But formation lights blinked faintly through the white, and one by one, they climbed into the dark. Over the North Sea, turbulence slammed the aircraft like waves. Several bombers were forced to turn back with frozen turrets or dead engines. Those who stayed fought to maintain course using the H-2X radar, a green glowing circle in the bombardier's station that barely distinguished land from sea. Every few minutes, lightning illuminated the horizon, revealing the endless line of bombers pressing forward. As they crossed into German airspace, Luftwaffe radar stations near Bremen lit up with distorted returns. Static hissed through the headsets of operators who could hardly separate cloud echoes from metal. By the time they realized what was happening, the bomber streams were already splitting, one heading toward Leipzig, another toward Gotha. Within minutes, chaos erupted across Germany. Interceptors scrambled from dozens of airfields. FW-190s, Bf-109s, and twin-engine night fighters. But many never left the ground. Snowdrifts clogged runways. Crosswinds flipped lighter aircraft on takeoff. Those who made it airborne found themselves flying blind, tossed like leaves through the storm. Yet above it all, the Americans kept coming. The first attacks struck the Messerschmitt assembly plants at Leipzig. Smoke and fire cut through the storm clouds. Civilians later described the sound as a waterfall of engines. Anti-aircraft batteries opened up blindly, firing into gray nothingness. By noon, more than 800 tons of bombs had been dropped across central Germany. Factories, airfields, and transport hubs were left burning beneath sheets of sleet. But it wasn't over. The next day, and the day after that, they came again. February 21st, February 22nd, February 23rd. Every morning, the same impossible sight repeated, the U.S. bombers rising into weather that seemed designed to kill them. On February 24th, the Luftwaffe threw everything it had. Over 500 German fighters took to the skies, intercepting the bomber streams near Gotha and Schweinfurt. The air battle that followed was one of the largest of the war, fought half in storm cloud, half in clear air, with flashes of gunfire lighting up the mist. American pilots later described the scene as a world made of noise and lightning. Tracer fire cut through the clouds like shooting stars. Bombers vanished, spiraled, exploded. But still, the formation held. German ace Walter Dahl remembered seeing B-17s materialize out of fog. Wings riddled with holes, engines burning, and still moving straight ahead. They would not turn back, he said. It was like fighting a force of nature. By the end of the fourth day, more than 3,800 sorties had been flown. Nearly 250 American bombers were lost. Thousands of men killed, captured, or missing. But the impact was staggering. German aircraft production dropped by almost half within weeks. Dozens of factories were destroyed or forced to relocate underground. The Luftwaffe's reserves of trained pilots dwindled. Many lost in the desperate intercepts through storm and snow. The weather had not saved Germany. It had destroyed it. And for the first time, the Allies realized they had broken something even greater than the enemy's factories. They had shattered the myth of the invincible German sky. The fifth day of Big Week dawned under skies that seemed to boil. Over northern Germany, the storm had deepened into a violent front of snow and hail. Visibility was close to zero. Even on the ground, airmen could hear the wind clawing at the hangars. Yet once again, the order came down. The mission stands. Crews gathered in briefing huts, still smelling of fuel and wet wool. Maps stretched across the walls showed lines of attack converging on the same deadly heartland. Regensburg, Stuttgart, Augsburg. The target this time, the final network of factories producing engines for the Me-109 and FW-190 fighters. The atmosphere was quiet. Men no longer spoke of weather or luck. They knew the risks. By this point, the weather was not an obstacle. It was the battlefield itself. At first light, the runways blurred into white as bombers thundered forward, lifting one after another into a sky that looked ready to collapse. Above the storm, the fight turned primal. Between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, the bomber formations flew straight into violent crosswinds. Clouds tore apart and reformed around them like smoke. Gunners couldn't see the enemy until the last second. Every few moments, a flash of tracer fire appeared, then vanished into the gray. German interceptors fought blindly, diving through cloud breaks guided only by radio. Some collided mid-air, others were ripped apart by turbulence. But still, they came. The Luftwaffe was throwing its last strength into the sky. Jagdgeschwader 26, JG-54, JG-11, veteran units that had fought since the Battle of Britain. For them, this was no longer defense. It was survival. At 11:30 a.m., over southern Germany, one of the fiercest air battles of the entire European campaign erupted. Hundreds of German fighters broke through the upper clouds, diving into the bomber streams head-on. Below them, American escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, and the newer, long-range P-51 Mustangs swept in to meet them. The battle lasted more than an hour. Lightning flashed through the storm clouds, blending with the flare of cannon fire. The roar of engines mixed with thunder until it was impossible to tell which was which. Veteran pilots later said it was like fighting inside a storm made of steel. One bomber group, the 445th, lost almost half its aircraft in a single engagement. Flames trailed behind falling planes, their light fading as they vanished into the clouds below. Yet the survivors kept formation, engines straining, faces numb from cold and fear. For every bomber that fell, another pressed forward. The resolve was mechanical, almost inhuman. The mission mattered more than the men. At 12:47 p.m., the bomb bays opened. Through sleet and turbulence, thousands of pounds of explosives fell toward the factories below. The blasts tore through production halls, fuel depots, and assembly lines. German civilians on the ground looked up through snow and smoke, unable to comprehend how the bombers had even reached them. The storm that was meant to protect them had betrayed them completely. By late afternoon, the formations turned west, battered but unbroken. Behind them, hundreds of fires burned across Bavaria and Saxony. German fighter control struggled to coordinate a response. Radio signals were breaking apart, and many airfields were unusable. In the control room of Luftwaffe Reich, the air defense commander looked at the situation map in disbelief. Red markers, representing confirmed bomber raids, covered nearly half the country. He reportedly muttered, "The weather no longer belongs to Germany." That night, the Americans counted their losses. 266 bombers gone, more than 2,600 men missing or dead. It was one of the costliest operations of the war, but the results were beyond expectation. Within a month, German aircraft output had collapsed. Fighter production, already strained by fuel shortages and damaged supply lines, dropped by nearly 60%. Factories once producing 2,000 aircraft a month now struggled to complete $800. Even more devastating was the loss of pilots. The Luftwaffe's veteran flyers, men who had survived since 1939, were dying faster than they could be replaced. Training programs were rushed, producing inexperienced replacements who barely knew how to navigate, let alone fight in storms. Big Week had done more than bomb factories. It had bled the Luftwaffe dry. In the weeks that followed, American crews noticed something different. Their missions grew quieter. The enemy interceptors came later in smaller numbers. The once coordinated attacks from multiple squadrons dissolved into scattered skirmishes. And when spring came, the skies over Europe began to clear, both literally and strategically. For the first time in the war, the U.S. Air Forces had established true air superiority. The Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter. It was the hunted. The weather, the weapon, and the will had all aligned, and from that storm, victory had begun to take shape. When the surviving bombers of Big Week limped back across the Channel, they returned to bases that looked like graveyards. Runways were lined with wrecks. Crews staggered out of their aircraft, their flight suits frozen stiff, faces cut by frost and exhaustion. Ground crews didn't cheer this time. They just helped the survivors down, silently counting how many hadn't made it back. Each mission had been a victory written in losses. 266 bombers gone in just a few days. Thousands of men missing, captured, or dead. Yet, despite the cost, Allied commanders saw something in the results that changed everything. Aerial photos taken days later showed smoking ruins where the Luftwaffe's industrial heart once stood. Assembly lines that had built Germany's fastest fighters were now piles of twisted steel. Whole towns, Regensburg, Gotha, Augsburg, had lost their capacity to rebuild the Air Force. But the true damage wasn't only physical, it was psychological. For years, the Luftwaffe had carried an almost mythical confidence. German pilots had ruled the skies since 1939, from Warsaw to Stalingrad. They believed no one could challenge them, especially not in bad weather. The storm barrier had been their invisible shield, a natural advantage that grounded enemies while they flew freely through Europe's winter skies. That myth died in February 1944. When the Americans crossed those storm fronts, They proved that weather, once a weapon for Germany, could be used against it. The message was clear. There was no longer anywhere to hide. In Berlin, the shock ran deep. Reports from field commanders were grim. Replacement aircraft couldn't reach operational units fast enough. Fuel deliveries had dropped by half. Maintenance crews were overwhelmed, scavenging parts from wrecked planes just to keep squadrons flying. Even worse, pilot training programs collapsed under pressure. Before Big Week, cadets received 250-300 flight hours. Afterward, the number dropped to barely 100, often less. New pilots were being sent into combat with less experience than American trainees had after their first solo flight. The result was predictable. When these inexperienced men faced U.S. formations in the months ahead, they didn't stand a chance. The Luftwaffe's edge, skill, discipline, experience had been shattered. Meanwhile, inside the American command rooms, strategy began to shift. General Carl Spaatz and General Jimmy Doolittle studied the results and saw an opportunity. The loss of German air production meant one thing: the skies were open for the next phase: invasion. If the Luftwaffe could be kept down, the Allies could land troops in France without being torn apart from above. Air dominance wasn't just about destroying factories, it was about preparing the ground for D-Day. From that moment on, the bombing campaigns intensified. But something else changed too. Doolittle gave his fighters a new order: no more strict escort formations. Instead of circling bombers defensively, they were to seek out and destroy German aircraft wherever they found them. This was revolutionary. It turned American fighter pilots from bodyguards into hunters. They began raiding enemy airfields, strafing hangars, and even ambushing takeoffs. The result was devastating. Within weeks, Luftwaffe commanders were reporting unprecedented losses, not just in the air, but on the ground. By April 1944, the skies over Europe were no longer contested. They belonged to the Allies. For the men who had flown through the storm, however, victory felt hollow. Many of them carried the faces of friends they'd lost that week. Some had watched their entire crews vanish in the clouds. Others had returned to empty bunks and folded flags. But deep down, they understood what their sacrifice had done. It had cracked open Hitler's fortress. It had silenced the Luftwaffe that once ruled the air. And it had set in motion the final act of the war in Europe. As one pilot later said in an interview, "We didn't just fight the Germans. We fought the weather, the fear, and everything that told us to turn back. But when we made it through, we knew the war had finally turned. That turn would soon become unstoppable. Factories in Germany struggled to recover. American bombers now flew in daylight without fear. And as spring arrived, the same weather that once shielded the Reich cleared the skies for an invasion that would seal its fate. But before the beaches of Normandy, before the fall of Berlin, there was this: a storm that became a battlefield. In the weeks that followed Big Week, intelligence officers compiled the data that would confirm what the air crews already sensed. The Luftwaffe had been broken. German fighter production dropped by nearly half in March. The factories at Regensburg, Leipzig, and Gotha were crippled, some completely destroyed. The Reich could no longer replace its losses faster than they were occurring. For the first time in the war, Allied planners could speak confidently about air supremacy. The weather, once an unpredictable enemy, was now an ally. American meteorologists had learned to read Europe's storms like maps: pressure fronts, cloud breaks, temperature layers, using them not as obstacles, but as camouflage. This mastery of the sky transformed how the Allies fought. Every mission after Big Week was planned not just by generals and strategists, but by weather officers who could predict how the atmosphere itself would behave over enemy territory. What had begun as reckless defiance, flying through storms, evolved into a science of precision warfare, and that was something the Germans could never replicate. Their meteorological systems, once superior, were now fragmented. Supply chains were collapsing, communication lines disrupted, radar networks bombed into silence. The Luftwaffe, once a force that dictated when others could fly, had lost even the ability to protect its own airspace. But in the quiet of Allied bases, the cost of this victory lingered. Rows of empty bunks stood untouched. Mess halls were quieter. Maintenance crews worked beside aircraft marked with the names of men who would never return. The snow around the hangars was still streaked with oil and frost, silent reminders of how thin the line between courage and loss had been. For every bomber that came home, another didn't. For every mission completed, dozens of families would soon receive telegrams beginning with the words, "We regret to inform you." Yet, even with the grief, the men understood what they had achieved. The impossible had been done, not by a single commander or machine, but by collective endurance. They had proven that technology, discipline, and raw determination could overcome even the most violent forces of nature. When historians later reviewed the air campaign, they would call it the turning of the sky, the moment when the Luftwaffe's domination truly ended, and the air belonged to the Allies. By May 1944, with the German Air Force crippled and weather tactics refined, the path to D-Day was clear. Fighter escorts could now cover bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Radar interference and storm navigation were no longer mysteries. American formations flew when the Germans couldn't, striking targets with precision even in heavy overcast. To the men in those cockpits, every flash of lightning, every gust of wind carried a memory of when they had first dared to enter the storm, when one veteran was asked years later how it felt to fly through weather that could kill them before the enemy even fired a shot. He said quietly, "It wasn't bravery. It was duty. The storm didn't stop us. It taught us what we could survive." That statement became the quiet truth of the campaign. Through storm, smoke, and loss, the U.S. Army Air Forces had proven something greater than technological superiority. They had shown that war wasn't only fought against an enemy, it was fought against the limits of human endurance itself. And as Europe's skies finally cleared in the summer of 1944, those who had once flown through the darkness looked out from their bombers at the breaking light, knowing the storm had not defeated them. It had revealed their strength. History often remembers battles by their names: Normandy, Midway, Stalingrad. But Big Week and the storm flights that defined it carried no single battlefield, no fixed front line. They took place in the shifting gray between earth and sky, a space where men fought not only an enemy, but the world itself. Those missions symbolized the essence of air warfare in the Second World War. Precision, born from chaos, courage tested by cold, and victory measured not in territory, but endurance. When American pilots flew through those storms, they weren't just challenging German defenses. They were challenging an idea that nature itself could dictate when a man could fight. They turned the skies into a proving ground for something far greater than machines: the will to adapt. Every war advances technology, but the lessons from these flights reached beyond engineering. The B-17s and B-24s that vanished into clouds became symbols of human resilience, of airmen who trusted their instruments when sight failed, who kept formation when thunder drowned their radios, who pressed forward when everything told them to turn back. In the decades that followed, the data and experience gained from these missions shaped modern aviation. Weather radar, storm-penetrating flight paths, and long-range navigation systems all trace their roots back to these perilous raids. The courage that defied weather became the science that conquered it. For the Germans, Big Week marked the beginning of the end, the moment when their air superiority dissolved into smoke and wreckage. For the Allies, It was the first glimpse of a future where the skies would no longer be ruled by fear. But for the men who lived it, the meaning was simpler. They didn't see themselves as heroes or symbols. They were young, often barely trained, and terribly aware of how fragile life was at 25,000 feet. Their victory wasn't born of glory, but of endurance. The quiet decision to keep flying through the storm because someone had to. When the clouds finally broke and sunlight spilled across Europe in 1944, it revealed more than just the path to victory. It revealed what the human spirit could endure when everything, the enemy, the weather, even fate, stood against it. And that is how the Allies learned to rule the skies. Not by waiting for clear weather, but by flying straight through the storm.